I teach the history of screenwriting, not film, to an MFA program for Stevens College. It's a low residency program. We do workshops at the Jim Henson studios in Hollywood for 10 days, twice a year, and then the students do the rest of their work online. I also am an adjunct at Cal State Fullerton, so I've had the pleasure of teaching all three of these gentlemen, so that's been a lovely thing. But I don't do this class there, so they haven't actually seen me do this. There with them, I've done screenwriting, we've done workshops. But here I'm going to talk about how I teach this class for a couple of reasons. And I gave it this particular name, The Voice of Silent Films and the Far From Silent Women Who Wrote Them. You'll see one of those books is by Cari Beachamp. It is, without lying down, the life story of Frances Marion, the highest paid screenwriter in Hollywood in the entire silent and early talkie period, and none of my students have ever heard of her. And I think it's very important that we hear about her and Anita Loos and a bunch of other important women. So, this whole conference is about inclusion and convergence, which made this topic seem useful to me, and hopefully useful to you. I've always gone back from my childhood to learning about Abigail Adams, the woman who told John, while you're working that Constitution, could you please remember the ladies? We tend to forget them in this town and in the history of this town. The other book that I've got there is What Happens Next, which everyone uses in their classes and has a paragraph about the women who that entire book covers. He finds time to cover them in a paragraph. And that makes my students crazy. They read 5 different books on the history of screenwriting chronologically, and they come to Frances last. And they're like, why have I not heard of her until now? And that book was written in the middle. So, some men wrote books before that book came out. They didn't know the women existed. Then they knew, and they still didn't write about them. And it's important that we are in these books, right? So I thought that was my background. This is my background in the business. These are all the different shows that I worked on. Always with a focus on the female characters. How can I make the female characters stronger? I'm a girl. Interestingly enough, I have a boy, a son. And when I had him, I thought, oh no, I'm supposed to have a girl so I can teach her to be a feminist. And then somebody went, no, you can teach him to love a feminist. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm good with that. So, and this is the stuff that I've written. Mostly focused on women in Doctor Who and how race is portrayed, women in aviation. I've just got an encyclopedia set on women in history. I'm part of the Women in Screenwriters Encyclopedia. And then my latest book is on the monkeys and feminism in the monkeys, because it was actually there in the show if you look hard enough. Anyway, I'm also on the editorial board for Written by Magazine and the book review editor for the Journal of Screenwriting. So if anyone's interested in writing book reviews for the Journal of Screenwriting, which publishes out of the UK, please let me know, because I'm always looking for book reviewers, and you get the book for free. But also, I have, the schools that I teach at have a subscription to the journal. I have students read journal articles, because I want them, this is a master's program, I want them to have a comfort level with that. But I have my undergrads at least do one journal article reading as well, to have an accessibility to that. And then I get the schools and or the kids to read Written by Magazine. Every month we do a different screenwriter or television writer on the front cover. It's a wonderful inside look at how the process of writing is done. The subscription is not that expensive, rather than a textbook for undergrads, but we also publish most of that online for free at the Written By website. So they can read these articles on their own as assignments and learn about all these writers. So I think all that stuff is valid in the class. This is about strategies of teaching film and television history and current events, which is what David will do when I'm done. And so, gee, I'm all about the chicks, so we have Dorothy Parker and we have Tina Fey. There is a direct line between those women, and if you love Tina Fey, you had better study a little bit of Dorothy Parker, or you don't understand why Tina Fey works today. So, why study screenwriting history? That's actually the first screen of a lecture that I give on this very topic to my students on the opening day. Because when you mention movies, nobody says, I love that shot in. They say, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father, prepare to die. They remember the words in the movies. They remember the screenwriting. But when we look at the history of teaching film, we're not doing that. We're teaching directors. Everyone can name their favorite films, and they normally can name the director of those films. You go to the next question, which is my first exercise in class. Name the writer. Lucky if they can. If it's a writer-director, they can. Otherwise, they can't, and they suddenly are embarrassed that they adore the words of a person whose name they can't tell you. If they have a favorite book, they know who wrote it, but they don't know who wrote their favorite film. So it's my goal to make them know that. I can't stand the auteur theory because I think it's bullshit. Directors aren't the authors of their films. I don't want to insult any directors in the class, but you can't, right? You can't direct something that doesn't exist on the page first. It's a collaborative thing, and directors are lovely. they've been given all the credit for far too long, because as we know, it goes back to all the book reviews in Cahiers and how they came up with that theory. It's nonsense. So I teach history, and I start in the silent film world, so I disagree with Warren. I go chronologically. This is a period they've never heard of, and all the movies are free on YouTube. Nothing like telling them they can watch whatever they have to watch for free. That works, right? And so here they meet Anita Loos, Jean Gontier, who's the first person to do filming in location. She went to Jerusalem to film the story of Jesus Christ, the first time it was put on film. And it's a really beautiful film you can see for free on YouTube. And then Jean McPherson, who wrote all of Cecil B. DeMille's early movies that were successes. When she stopped working for him, all his stuff failed. Nobody knows her name, and she's quite brilliant. So I think it's important for women students today to know that women once ran Hollywood. So all this discussion about, I don't know if women should direct a movie, is not worth having. Because they did, and they were. They were the highest paid people in this town. So I think that's an important thing for them to remember. In Beacham's book, you'll see all these famous women. My great joy is one of my students who teaches directing found Lois Weber in my class, who wrote and directed her films back in the day, and now incorporates her into this set of directors that he teaches as examples, right? Because she had that kind of career back in the day. Of course, Adela Rogers St. Eve Unsell ran her own production company for Universal for 10 years, made a ton of movies that are very, very successful in the day. She also allows us to go into a place where we discuss the problems with films, whether it's back then or today, because she was involved in what back then were yellow race films, which are anti-Asian American films, and so that's something students should understand about. So again, that goes back to the title of what we're talking about, and I talk fast because I'm Sicilian. I also don't want to eat up all the time. So I think it's really important to teach silent films because we're teaching the screenwriters that the visual is as important as the verbal. Much as I love the words more, you do have to think about how they're shown. And of course, these are visuals that show us the emotion of the moment. And I think that they're really beautiful. So it's fun for the students, I totally agree with Warren, to have this heritage in their life, to understand that this all came before them. I think that's very, very important. Teaching silent films allows you to teach diversity again, because there were filmmakers of all colors and ethnic backgrounds. Much of that work has been lost. Some of it is findable. Oscar Michaud was one of the people that I found for my students. He was a hugely successful African-American writer-director. He also wrote novels, and he translated his novels into films. One of them is called Within Our Gates, and it's free on YouTube as well. And he looked at middle-class African-Americans talking in the 1910s and presented them to the audience in ways that other movies were not. And I think it's important for them to know his work in line with Cecil B. DeMille and D.W. Griffith and all those other guys. Because they're not the only men, they're not the only people who were around, but if you looked at film history classes, that's all they learned. And that really, really bothers me. I think when you teach silent films and early films, of course, you're teaching character, because that's where all these archetypes came from. Yes, we can go back to France, and we'll go back to Aristophanes. They came from way back then. But on film, they came from this time period. And we find all these characters in these early films, sometimes in more simplistic ways, which helps students understand how to get back to the simple part of their story. Who wants what, and what's getting in their way. And you see that in this quick film. You can teach structure in teaching silent films, because we all know the purpose of having 3 acts is because you had reels, and you had 1 reel, and then 2 reels, and then 3 reels, and they began to write in terms of that. There's also Paul Gugino's sequence approach, which is just about each reel. You have 8 reels, 8 sequences. The visual of, oh, that's why they do it this way, because they had to swap through. I get it. It helps students understand the history of this profession. I love that Warren calls it a profession, because that's what it is. So the 3-act structure. So why are we studying this? Because I believe, and we can prove, that writers have been lost in the history of film. If you look at this, what do we all know? We all know this movie is by who?
Batman.
Frank Capra, right? Right. Look at this thing. No. Screenplay by Frank Capra. You can't read this from there. I can barely read this from here. All right? This movie, which plays perennially at Christmas 1,000,000 times, was written by them. Frances Goodrich and Albert Hackney, married screenwriting team who worked for 35 years together until she died. They were the highest paid screenwriting team, and they're nothing to sneeze at, because they got a Pulitzer for the play, The Diary of Anne Frank. And then they adapted it into film. And it kills me that children know Anne Frank, They know It's a Wonderful Life, and they know Frank Capra. Frank Capra, who you all know the Robert Riskin anecdote, right? He turned in 200 blank pages. He was the screenwriter behind much of Capra's work, and Capra had the famous Capra touch, and he would run around town discussing, well, that movie has the Capra touch, that's why it's successful. So Robert Riskin had a deadline for his screenplay for Capra, and he handed in 200 pages of blank nothing, and he said, put your fucking touch on that. Because you cannot direct what does not exist. And that's an important, now there may be an anecdote, we're not sure, but it's a reminder of the truth. So here we have this Pulitzer Prize winning set of writers whose students have never heard of. You have to look at a book that their nephew wrote about them. You only get in the story if someone puts you in the story. Luckily, their nephew did. And it's a really fun little book at their life in Hollywood and New York. They're the people behind Nick and Nora Charles. Dashiell Hammett wrote the novel. If you read the novel, Nora is nothing. She's just his wife, and she drinks a lot, and she's pretty. In the movie, she has agency, and she helps solve the case because Frances Hackett was a female writer on the movie adaptation, and she made sure the woman had something to do. She has a great quote where she says, I was always the only woman in the room when stories were being discussed, and it was my job to protect the women in the program, in the film, in the story, or nobody else would. And if you look at that, it's so interesting. They did 6 Thin Men movies. The Hacketts only wrote the first 3, and when you come to the 4th one, Nora becomes a dumb chick. Doesn't understand what the cops are doing or what the laws are, and she does funny jokes and falls on her face. They entirely lost the believability of that character when the woman who was protecting her left the writing part of that character. It's the saddest thing in the world to see. Also, if you look at the difference between the novel and the movie, in the novel, they're kind of flighty and silly. In the movie, they love each other, they're adorable to each other. This is the marriage of Frances and Albert Hackett. This is not Dashiell Hammett and Lillian Hellman, because they were never actually married, as we know, because Hammett never left his wife, right? So that wasn't a marriage, and that wasn't 2 people who understood a marriage. They had a relationship, but it was entirely different than the one that appears on screen. That comes from the writers who adapted the movie, who don't get any credit, which makes me nuts. So, why do we study screenwriting history? Because we need to know these stories, and we need to pass those stories on to our students so they pay attention to who wrote the movie. Because that's the person whose message you're accepting into your life when you see that movie. The other thing we argue about in the Writers Guild all the time is we have this business where we have the credit, it's always a film by the director, right? If he's a writer-director, fine, okay? But if there's nothing of that, then why does he get this credit and why don't the writers get that credit? And we can't get rid of that because the Directors Guild will not get rid of it. Makes me nuts, makes me nuts, makes me nuts, but it's true. So this perpetually puts it in the audience's and the student's mind that this is the person to credit for that movie, and that is not true. Same thing, obviously we know all of these wonderful movies by Spike Lee. Yes, at the beginning, yes, he did write and direct She's Gotta Have It, but he did Malcolm X with Arnold Pearl. Everybody remembers Arnold Pearl, right? That's important. And he did Chirac with Kevin Wilmot, and of course he adapted from Aristophanes and La Sistrana. So let's remember there were other writers involved, but there's still only a Spike Lee joint movies. That's the only credit that's given above the title. And that's something that we're fighting against in our classes, right? This is from the very beginning with D.W. Griffith. It's not his movie, right? He shouldn't get the credit. Then again, it's a terrible movie, and I hope nobody ever teaches this movie. I always tell my students, we'll never touch this movie. It's all awful. And everything that someone says you're supposed to learn from it about close-ups and tracking shots are in all the movies by all these women that I'm telling you about. So watch one of their movies and show those things. Don't watch his movies. I love John Carpenter because he's the one who said, let's be fair, it's a collaboration. Let's be honest about it. I do this, they do that, we blend together. And that is what makes a product really good. So why are we doing this? Why are we studying screenwriting history? Because who tells your story is important. All the books about screenwriters have been written by men. They write about all the important men, they read each other's books, they repeat what they learned in the last book. Cari came out of nowhere and said, who's this lady whose paycheck is bigger? I want to find out about her life. And as she delved into it, she found the 14 women around her who are all friends, part of the same sort of pack of friends, who wrote movies, as I said, Anita Loos and all those other women. It matters that students understand any history book they read is not the entire history of what they're reading about, right? There's no way to fit it all in a book, so you have to do your own research and move further, which is what I have them do. So again, like I said, they got into the story because their nephew put them in the story. I think that's cool. So I think it's really important to give voice to these women through teaching this. Representation matters. This is one of my favorite Facebook memes going around right now. For children of today, this is a huge deal, right? When I was a kid, Luke was the Jedi. We didn't know until a later movie that Leia could be, and she never got to be. Like, wait a minute, why isn't she as good as him? Why didn't Obi-Wan find her? So it's important for kids to see that. And finally, I like to teach silent films because I always tell them, as academics or as writers, we're standing on the shoulders of the people who came before us. We need to credit them with being the world first and giving us the foundation to build and live off of. That's important to me. It's not all, folks. In my classes, I make them read books, so they review books that are about writing, and there's a ton of them, but I just picked these particular pictures because they're fun. I love Doctor Who. I've done a lot of stuff on Doctor Who. This is a great book. Basically, a journalist connected with Russell T Davies, who was producing the first 5 years of the remake, first 7 years, and he said, can I email you anytime, and just say, what are you thinking about? And you just give me a quick answer. So it's a series of emails, which makes it easy for kids to read, and it's a very thick book. And he will say things like, well, today I had the idea, what if water was like acid and it killed people? And about 5 pages later, I wonder if it's the water on another planet like Mars. And 2 chapters later, he's written an entire script called Waters of Mars, and there's a copy of the script, and you can see the genesis from the idea all the way through, and then he discusses production, because he's the executive producer. He'll talk about, I got this guest star, oh no, she pulled out, I need to rewrite the character to suit this person. Gives you a real understanding of what the job is to be a writer of television. And obviously John Gregory Dunn, all those guys. But I think they should always read one book, and I find many of them tell me they haven't read a book in a long time, and or this is the longest book I've ever read. But they generally tend to like them if you force them to do it. I think that that's a good assignment. And I also make them write a paper on one famous screenwriter from any of the eras I talk about. I don't just do silence, I start with them. Of course, I move through the modern day. So they get to pick someone, and again, I put up the encyclopedia because I think all university libraries should have a copy of it. It's put out by a friend of mine in the UK. So I think that's a really cool thing. It always brings me back to, it's all about remembering the ladies. We need to teach as much of that as possible to get past all the stuff that hasn't been said all these years ago. And that's why that's what I do.
Nice.
Thank you so much.
All right.